There are many things that we think of as obedience that I want to argue are not actually obedience. Compliance is not obedience. Obedience is not a virtue that one can practice in isolation. By definition, obedience involves other people. These judgments we're making are, in fact, based on our own epistemological world, right? What do we do when we disagree about epistemology, when we disagree about the basic facts of the matter or about the worldview or whatever it is that we use to make these judgments? Getting into a situation is a bad time to think about where your red line is.
My guest today is Dr. Pauline Shanks Kaurin, who is the Stockdale Chair and Professor of Professional Military Ethics at the US Naval War College, where she specialises in military ethics, just war tradition, and applied ethics. Her recent publications include When Less is Not More, Expanding the Combatant-Non-Combatant Distinction, With Fear and Trembling, A Qualified Defence of Non-Lethal Weapons, and Achilles Goes Asymmetrical, The Warrior, Military Ethics, and Contemporary Warfare. Additionally, Pauline was a featured contributor for The Strategy Bridge and has published in Clear Defense, The Wavell Room, Newsweek, War on the Rocks, Ground and Curiosity, US Naval Institute Proceedings, Just Security, as well as a variety of academic journals. She's also the author of the book I just finished, titled On Obedience, Contrasting Philosophies for Military, Citizenry and Community, which is the topic of our discussion today. As you will find out, the subject matter that this book addresses goes to the core of what it means to be a soldier, but also what it means to be a citizen. Both, as we'll find out, are infused with certain rights and responsibilities, which are critical to the functioning of our democracies, but are rarely discussed. Pauline, thank you very much for joining me on The Voices of War.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'll just say up front that I'm here in my personal capacity and not representing the views of the Department of Defense, Department of Navy, or the US Naval War College, but super excited to be here and super excited that you read my book.
Yeah, and I want to firstly thank you for clarifying that, but also as far as the book is concerned, as I mentioned to you before, I showed you just the number of tags I've got in the book. I think I'm probably around 30, which I think ought to be indicative of what I thought of the book and its importance and how many subjects it covers that are absolutely critical to, as I said in the intro, understanding what it means to be a soldier, but also the roles and responsibilities of citizens. I feel it's one of those books that I'll keep going back to time and time again, because each chapter, I think, has its, almost its own book within it that one could explore and unpack in a lot more detail. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Well, I wrote it for people to read who are not just academics. So it's very gratifying that people who are not philosophers are reading it. And the tags in the book may also be your points of rebuttal, which is fine too. As philosophers, we like that. So
they're not rebuttal. I think they're questions, and I know I've sent you a couple ahead of time. But yeah, certainly a couple of questions that were inspired by key points in the book, the least that it resonated with me. Now, but maybe before we dive into the kind of obedience idea and what it means, maybe we can find out a little bit about you and what motivated, firstly, your entry into philosophy, and then why military ethics? Where does it come from for you?
So my journey is not a linear journey by any means. My father was an Air Force non-commissioned officer. He was a missileer, and so grew up watching war movies and arguing with my father about whether air power was supreme. I thought it wasn't, and he thought it was. So learned to argue and debate things pretty early on. But I went to college thinking I was going to go to law school, and got to college and took was in the honors program. The first class was a philosophy class, ancient Greek philosophy. And so kind of got into philosophy in that way. But in my third year, I took a philosophy of law class where we talked about action and intention and mens rea. And also at the same time had been interested in international relations, but I couldn't decide which of those I wanted to do. And so in my senior year, I did foreign policy semester at American University in Washington, D.C. So it was my version of study abroad because my dad wouldn't bring for me to go overseas. We said, well, you can go to DC. That's practically a foreign country anyway. And got there and did a wonderful internship, but discovered that that wasn't my vibe. So decided to go to graduate school in philosophy. And I went to the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg for my master's, and then went to Temple in Philadelphia for my PhD and took a military ethics class there. But it wasn't until I took that class that I really realized how philosophy and international relations, how my interests fit together. And so that's how I got into military ethics. And I always enjoyed philosophy, but there were pieces of it that were too abstract for me. And I enjoyed international relations, but there were pieces that weren't conceptual enough for me. So military ethics was kind of the natural blending of those two, somewhere in an Aristotelian mean.
Why is that? I mean, maybe it's obvious to some, but why is military ethics a link between international relations and philosophy?
Because I think military ethics asks questions about the morality and the ethics of things that we do in international relations, specifically around questions of war and when we engage in war and when we ought to engage in war. At least when I was in college, classical realism held sway. This was like in the late 80s, early 90s. Now I'm betraying my antiquity here. But, it was the end of the Cold War. And so classical realism was still very much what my professors were teaching. And there was no discussion of ethics and international relations. So military ethics was sort of the place where the two can have conversation with each other. They don't always have conversations with each other. And one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, especially now that I teach at the War College, is what's the intersection between strategy and ethics. So I spent last term teaching in our strategy and policy class and doing what I call ethical experiments, trying to get my students to think about ethics and strategy, they were good sports. And it was really interesting, but so it's sort of a melding of two different disciplines, at least two for me. And I'm not the kind of person that can just sort of settle in one place. To go back and forth, which if you read the book, there's a lot of Henry V in one chapter, and then there's some discussion of Aristotle, and then there's Hume, and then there's some moral psychology. And so I was never really good at focus.
No, but I think that's what gives your argument depth, because I think you straddle a number of topics, and it won't resonate with just one stream of thought or one school of thought. I mean, just even in this last answer, you've straddled, 3 or 4 ultimately domains, whether it's realpolitik and might is right, and how we link that to strategy, and how we then infuse ethics to then go and fight the war. So it kind of applies from the macro to the micro. And I think that's, in my view, at least, that was the strength of the book, because you can really link the power of the state and the duty and responsibility of the state to the power of the soldier and the duty and responsibility of the soldier. And I'm conscious that both of those words, duty and responsibility, are complex in themselves. But maybe we can now dive into the actual book. What is the main thesis of your book? And most importantly, who is it written for?
Well, my Achilles book was written for academic audience. And it was my scholarly track record for 15 years, different papers and things that I've written. This I wrote from scratch, and it was really written for more of a lay audience. It was written more for military practitioners, for people who are interested sort of broadly in national security, for people who are interested in philosophy, and mainly for my students, because obedience was something that kept coming up in many of the classes that I taught when I taught undergraduates. Obedience always seemed to be coming up and was something that students were interested in. And when I started thinking about writing this book, it was 2015, 2016. So we were in the midst of presidential election, and all kinds of interesting things were coming up. And I also taught Army ROTC, participated in their program at this institution. So I had Army cadets who took my military ethics class. So lots of these kinds of questions were coming up. So it was really to engage some of these questions in a deeper way. And when I looked around there weren't a lot of philosophical treatments of obedience outside of religious obedience. There's some treatments around civil obedience and disobedience, and there's a huge literature on that. But there wasn't a lot of literature just thinking about, well, what exactly is obedience? And in particular, when is it morally justified? And so the thesis of the book is that in order for obedience to be a virtue, and it's not always a virtue, but in order for it to be a virtue, it has to be justified in certain kinds of ways. And I use just war criteria like legitimate authority and some other criteria to try to suss out under what conditions is obedience a virtue? How is it related to other virtues like loyalty and discipline? And then what does this look like in practice? How do we figure out what the right thing to do is? And ultimately, I come down to this idea that obedience is negotiation, that it's not as simple, and it's not either you're obedient or you're not. It's a range. There's a range between obedience and disobedience and lots of stuff in between. And that it's not just a virtue for military. So we have to think about this in the civilian context and in lots of, I use Alistair McIntyre's notion of community of practice. And certainly the military is a community of practice.
What does that mean, again, for those who are yet to read the book?
So a community of practice is essentially a group of people who are bounded by a shared history, values, sense of norms, sense of practices. So that could be the U.S. Army. It could be the Naval War College. It could be a religious community. It could be Rhode Island, where I live, as a political community. It could be the United States of America. It could be, Australia. So there's different kinds of communities of practice and different sizes, but they share some kind of shared history, value, sense of what it means to be a member of that community. And of course, that can change. That changes over time. What it means to be an American is different now than it was at our founding, right? But there is this sense of belonging to this community. And part of what I was trying to get at, so much of the literature on obedience focuses on it as an individual question. Am I going to be obedient to the dress code at the Naval War College or not? But I think it misses a really important piece, which is that obedience is not a virtue that one can practice in isolation. By definition, obedience involves other people. So when I tell my kid to go clean his room, right, whether he's obedient or not, there's a community of practice. It may just be the two of us implicated there. So obedience is one of these really interesting virtues. Philosophers would say it's not just self-regarding, thinking about myself, but it's other-regarding. It involves other people too.
And I guess see how it's embodied, how obedience is embodied in a particular community of practice dictates their behavior. And in many ways, in my mind, at least, I kind of hear it almost as a subculture or habits of a particular social group, whatever that social group might be. It could be a football club, like you said, to a unit in the military. And it's the norms and practices and symbols that are carried and embraced by that particular social group. That's all part of how they contextualized who they are and also who they're not, how they set themselves apart from someone else. Yeah. Right.
So it's not quite American football season yet, but I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan, and that's how I identify. But I live in Patriots country, unfortunately. Right. And so there's very different ways of being, right, between the two football clubs as there are between American football clubs as there are between, I guess we would say, regular football, right? You all would say regular football. And so we have to, I think obedience can't be understood apart from those communities. So in the terms of the military, that's the military profession. In terms of, citizenry, that is probably going to be our political and social communities, right? Yeah. And so those play a part too. It's not just what the individual thinks.
Yeah. So can we define obedience to set a starting definition of the term, and then we'll kind of explore a little bit more into whether it's a virtue, the negotiation, loyalty, differences between these different terms that you unpack in the book.
Yeah, so I'm going to do that academic thing, though, and say on page 46.
Please do. And for us at home, we'll follow along.
Yes. Open your hymnals. So sort of the working definition of obedience at the beginning of the book is that obedience is the intentional and voluntary carrying out of orders or commands given by a commander or other authority figure who represents legitimate political authority in action. And that's one of the just war criteria, right? So it has to be intentional and voluntary, and it has to be something in response to some commands or orders. And those orders have to be issued by some kind of legitimate political authority relative to the context. So when I tell my 14-year-old to go clean his room, I'm the legitimate political authority in my house, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I start, and then we have to move into thinking about what makes obedience a virtue, when is it morally justified, and so on, and the arguments about practical reasoning and negotiation are designed. The first half of the book is fleshing out, okay, what does obedience look like? When is it a virtue? The second half is, okay, how would this work in practice, and how do we figure out when we should obey, whether we should obey, to what degree should obey? And then talked about some case studies where people, in one case, engaged in mutiny, and how that was actually a negotiation around the bounds of obedience.
This was the French in World War I think, was it? That you then use an example.
The French mutinies on the Western Front, which is really interesting because they renegotiated command authority. Because you can't fight a war if people won't fight. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, that's the kind of, it's the idea of leadership, right? If you are not leading anyone, then are you really a leader? It's the same kind of thing. If no one's obedient to you, then do we have obedience? One of the flags, a number of times I've put flags in the book, is this idea of intentional and voluntary. And the reason those two particular words strike me, because my particular area of interest, or that's something that I've explored in the podcast a number of times before, is to what extent are we as autonomous as we'd like to think that we are? And the reason I say that is, in fact, I just a couple of days ago, I spoke to Jessica Wolfendale after of her book on war crimes. And she does talk about the situationalist account and then the dispositional account, how the environment can shape us. And of course, she does rightly, I think, explain in the book that it's, yes, the situation matters, but so does the personality, character, the person that will ultimately produce behavior. But for me, intentional and voluntary, if I can shape someone's behavior by creating certain conditions and circumstances, to what extent can I then say that it was their own volition that they actually did something? Because we know through a number of experiments, whether it might be obedience, I think you of course mentioned obedience, Milgram's obedience research. To what extent did those people flick that switch or turn that knob to the lethal electricity intentionally and voluntary? And 60% or 62% of them did in one case at least. So just some kind of opening thoughts on that, maybe.
Yeah. So first of all, if I had to, as we said before we got started, I wrote this book very fast, within the space of a year and a half,
which is incredible given the density and the depth of the book.
And it was written from scratch. I just sat down and said, I think I'll write a book about obedience. And so one of the things that I would clarify, if I could go back and rewrite it, which I think is implicit in the book, but it's not made explicit. There are many things that we think of as obedience that I want to argue are not actually obedience. Compliance is not obedience, right? And so I choose voluntary and intentional very intentionally. And part of what I'm thinking about, I'm sorry, we have to digress through Aristotle.
Please,
But I'm a philosopher. So in book 3 of Nicomachean Ethics, for those of you at home want to look it up, he distinguishes between voluntary, involuntary, and mixed action. Involuntary actions are those that come from the agent. Mixed actions are where there's some kind of influence or pressure or something in the environment that gets the agent to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do, but it still comes from them. So it gives this famous example of a ship's captain, and the ship, he's sailing into a storm, and if he doesn't throw the cargo overboard, the ship's going to sink. Under normal circumstances, the captain would not be throwing cargo overboard, right? But because of the circumstances, he chooses to do so. But we would still say, okay, it wasn't a coerced action. It wasn't an involuntary action. He was still making a choice. And I think many of our actions in military ethics probably are more in the mixed realm, which worried me when it comes to obedience, because if we're going to reify obedience as a virtue, I think it's got to be voluntary, right? And I think of a lot of what we do. So I work for the government, and so we have to do all these required training, right? Left to my own devices, like that is not what I would be doing with my free time. I still choose to do it. Like I sit down and put on my calendar, okay, today I'm going to do my required training. So it's more of a mixed action. But I would say my actions there, I wouldn't say they're obedience in the full sense. I would say that's more like compliance.
Okay.
And I use some examples from Tim O'Brien's writing from the things they carried. And part of, he tries to decide whether he's going to flee to Canada to evade the draft. And he ultimately decides not to, basically because, as he describes it, the path of least resistance. And I argue that action is not actually obedience, right? Or it's passive obedience is the term that I use, which is really more like some kind of compliance, right? Yeah. So I think there's a sort of range of behaviors. And if we're going to hone in, what I'm interested in is the kind of obedience that we would want to say is a virtue and that you have a moral obligation to engage in. And so I want a very narrow definition of obedience, because I don't want compliance, right? On the other hand, I don't want something where people are coerced. Clearly, that's not obedience, right? If I hold a gun to someone's head and say, you're going to do that, and they do it, that's not obedience, right?
Yeah, and this is, I guess, So I was going to say, this is where it becomes interesting in my view. I mean, I've we don't have to get into the debate of free will and et cetera. But in fact, I did have Greg Caruso on, who's a noted free will skeptic. And I tend to subscribe to the similar view that I'm a product of everything that's come before me. And I didn't make a choice of any of that. I didn't choose where I was born, which language I speak, my circumstances, the people that I met who gave me an opportunity, as much as I voluntarily at that instance, or at least, there's a difference between voluntary, but choice to me is a difficult word, because I don't necessarily agree that choice comes into it. It's only what thought pops up into my mind, which I don't control, that will ultimately determine the decision I make voluntarily. And where this becomes a challenge for me is because the information that I have, the environment that I'm infused in, the community of practice that I'm a part of, the embodied norms and behaviors that I'm co-creating and embodying and a part of, but also consuming and belonging to, it's very difficult to demand of me such power, strength, to be able to step outside of all of that, the weight and the burden of my previous history and myself and my life and everything else, to step outside of that and then look at whether it's the right thing to do to be obedient or not in a particular given setting. Unless I've had prior experience, unless I've hit previous bumpers that have made me think about these things, right? Which is why I like these conversations, because hopefully there will be bumpers for someone, as they're listening and they're driving, that, maybe ethics and these types of discussions are important for what they do in the day-to-day life. But I wonder how you view choice and, I guess, the power of the environment and interacting with a person and everything they embody.
Yeah, so I think back to Aristotle's view about mixed actions, I tend to be what philosophers call a soft determinist.
Okay.
So I think that
we're speaking the same language, I think.
Yes, the lots of influences in our environment, but it's not the case that we have no choices. So I liken it to a salad bar. You don't control what's at the salad bar, but once you walk up to the salad bar, you can, among the choices that you're given, you can construct the salad in a certain way and not in others.
But is there not a reason that you're doing that? I mean, as in, there's a reason why you like, tomatoes and not capsicum. Which is why
but it might be like, and I tend to be on the soft determinist side, because I also think human beings are just unaccountable. Like I might walk up to the salad bar and say, I really like tomatoes, but today I think I'm going to try cucumbers, even though last time I had cucumbers, I got really sick because I'm just feeling rebellious today or whatever it is. Right.
But there's the reason. There's the cause.
Right.
Where did that come from?
It could just be like, I feel like doing this today. So I think there's lots of influences in our environments. Now, the question about sort of being able to step outside, and especially, I think this book came out in 2020. So the conversation about disinformation was not in the same place when I was writing. Yeah. And I was writing this in 2016, 2017, 2018. So there was a conversation about disinformation. There was disinformation going on, but people weren't obsessed with epistemology, theory of knowledge, in the way that they are now, which is great. As a philosopher, like, I'm super excited to see that. Because lots of epistemologists now have jobs that they didn't before. So I think we do have to reckon with that. But I think if we're going to say people are morally responsible, then that requires something I think of as agency. So my issue isn't and you notice the language in the book isn't did they choose this? It's did it come from them? Are they the agent? Are they the causal originator of the thing? Right? That doesn't, and I spent a lot of time undergraduate, like, dealing with action theory and thinking about determinism and all that kind of stuff. And that stuff gives me headaches. I think agency is a more productive way to think about it, because then we could go in and look at the agency and say, are there influences, and to what degree do those influences interfere with someone's agency? So I have a 14-year-old. And I would say some things in his environment are such that he's not quite a full moral agent yet with regard to certain things. And other things he completely is, because he's learned how to step back and step outside. But I do think we do have, if we're going to have moral responsibility, we do have somewhat of a moral obligation to tend to our own epistemology. And many people either don't want to do that. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do, right? Especially if looking at your own epistemology involves questioning or coming to terms with beliefs that are really central. So I sort of hold what's called a coherence theory of truth, right? I think we're epistemological conservatives. We have lots of beliefs, and for most people, they fit together, right? We have a universe of beliefs that all fit together. Some of them may be like super wacky to other people. But for you, that makes sense. But they all fit together. Like leopard shoes are the center of my epistemological universe, right? Along with steak, right? But if my friend who's a vegetarian says to me, do you realize all the harm that comes from your steak eating? And I really take this on board, and I rethink that commitment to steak being the center of my epistemological universe. The problem is that isn't just one belief in isolation. It's connected to other beliefs. It's like changing out, it's not changing out an end table in your living room. It's like changing out your entire kitchen. You got to recalibrate everything. And that's a pain. Like, it's huge. And it's disorienting, and it's existentially traumatic. Like, people are not going to do that. Most people. So I think that's a real question, but I think we can still have agency. It may be a more limited kind of agency, but I think we still have some agency. And so we calibrate responsibility to the level of agency that people have, right? The ship's captain, we're not going to hold him to the same standard of responsibility for losing the cargo as we would if there had been no storm and he's like, dude, I just didn't feel like I wasn't feeling it. So I just decided to throw it overboard. Dude, hey, we're holding you totally responsible for that one. The storm.
There are no mitigating circumstances.
Right. There's no mitigating circumstances. So I think that, and I've argued this in other places as well, that I think agency is a complicated notion. It's not as simple as you either have agency or you don't. Right. I think, like with obedience, it's a range. So my teenager comes home late from, he was supposed to be home at a particular time. And I say to him, I was about to call the cops, like, what's up? And he was like, yeah, I just didn't check my phone. And I lost track of time and we were having a great time. And are those mitigating circumstances? Well, kind of, but they're ones that he could have addressed, right? They weren't outside of his control, or it wasn't peer pressure. It wasn't something that I could look at and say, okay, you're a teenager, you're still, the frontal lobe is still developing and you're still trying to figure things out. You just didn't check your phone. And then he says to me, yeah, I knew if I check my phone, then I have to know what time it is. And I don't want to do
well,
that.
the thought didn't pop up into his mind, right? And that's
or it's just the bot popped up and he's like, well, I'm not going to do that because if I know what time it is, then that I might have to change my behavior and I'm having a good time and I just don't want to do that.
Don't want to do that. Right? Yeah.
That's a different situation than if his phone was dead, he couldn't check the time, or had been a lot of peer pressure. His friends said, no, I really want you to stay. Then we would have had a conversation about how do you deal with peer pressure and what are the consequences of that. So I think there's different ways to think of agency. So the private first class, the youngest enlisted person in the military has agency, but not the same kind of agency that a general or flag officer has, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we have to think about this in a more nuanced way. So I wanted an account of obedience that was also going to be nuanced. It's either obedience or disobedience. And it's either, and I didn't want to call a virtue what is really compliance. Compliance is not a virtue. So this is an attempt to have a more nuanced account. But of course, that means that it's really messy. Right?
I think what it does is absolutely what it should do. And that's it should invite us to wrestle with these questions. And I think that's, in my view, which is why I say this is a book I'll keep coming back to, because there's, and I absolutely love the fact that you've got the case studies in the last chapter and then the questions. I mean, talk about professional military education. I mean, you could, grab a platoon or a company or a battalion and get them to chew on these.
Yeah, that was quite intentional because this seems like a topic that whether you're civilian or military, like this, and this is a question that always came up with my undergraduates, like trying to think about where are the lines here and what would you do in X, Y, and Z situations? These are really difficult situations. Yeah. And the book debuted in March 2020, just as we were locking down for COVID. Ooh. So my grand book tour, it wasn't going to be that grand, but I was going to go to DC and hang out with some friends.
It was via Zoom.
Ended up via Zoom, but then in May 2020, the Lafayette Square happened, where General Milley marched to Lafayette Square with President Trump, and you had these protests. Some people called them riots. You have all of these questions about, was the military going to be called to put down political protests and so on? So all of these questions happened. So when the first sort of round of calls came for podcasts like yours, right, what people were really interested in was Chapter 9, which is on civil military relations, which is something I sort of dabble in. It's not a central area, but that's the issue, along with the issue eventually of vaccinations, right? Should members of the military obey the order if they're commanded to get the COVID vaccination? They're commanded to get all kinds of like bazillions of other vaccinations, but this became a big issue, right? So it was interesting what I had in mind when I was writing the book, but then sort of events overtook.
Yeah, it played out.
After it was already in the can and I couldn't change anything, then all this stuff happened. And so, and then January 6th, of course, happened.
Of course. In fact, I think that was one of the questions.
A year later.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the questions kind of I alluded to, at least, and I know it was kind of a little bit later in the piece I wanted to address it, but we are talking about obedience and we kind of talked about a little bit about the idea of misinformation, disinformation. The way I understand obedience, I mean, I can only, unless it's blind obedience, which is what we don't want, and your book makes that very clear. We don't want blind obedience. We want, well, as you say, intentional and voluntary. In other words, my agency matters. I'm not merely a tool of the state that can be kind of wielded whichever way the state wants. And when I say I mean anybody that's in a military uniform. Yeah. And we had this almost paramilitary in the US. Well, not almost, it really is militia, as they would like to call themselves, oftentimes better armed than certainly the local police force. And of course, when the president then says, stand back and stand by.
Yeah.
And in their lived experience, the only information they have, the only bubble they embody, the only community on practice they live with is one that tells them that the state is oppressing you, the state will take your elections, the state will put chips into your arm. The state is, a cabal of child molesters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if that's all they know, and then even the president says, stand back and stand by, can we say that they're disobedient or are they obedient? I mean, where's the line?
Yeah, and I don't think it's an either or here, right? Because there's two things. First of all, we could ask not just what they believed, but what they had the capacity to know. So if you don't, so it's one thing if you believe X, Y, and Z is the case, like that everyone should wear leopard high heels.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe I really hold that belief and I orient my world around it, which I do. Take a look at my closet and you'll see, right?
You embody that community of practice. Yeah.
But I am also fully aware that there are, in principle, other views, right? And I could, if I so chose, go access those views. I think they're wrong, but I'm aware that they're there. So the question here, and I think this is a really important question with disinformation. I don't have a good answer to this. Maybe Clint Watts, who is a really smart guy on disinformation in the United States, could help us with this. I think there are some people who are in that bubble who are aware that there are other views and they just think they're wrong. They just choose to ignore them, in which case then their actions that come about as a result of being in that bubble is still a choice. So there's a famous sort of example of like you get drunk and get in a car and hit someone. The question becomes, did you choose to get drunk? If you did, right, then that action, right, is maybe mixed, but it still came from you. Whereas if someone slipped you some kind of drugs or something, and you weren't aware there was alcohol, or you weren't aware that you've been drugged, and then you got in the car, that's a different thing. So I think the group of people who literally don't know they're in a bubble and don't have access to any other information, I think there probably is a group of those people. I think it's probably really small. And so I think we have to treat them as a different case. Yeah. This is sort of the cult mentality. Yeah, right? That's right. Right. But I think there are other people who are like, listen, I like this particular worldview because I just don't like liberals. Right? And they make fun of me and I don't like them. And, they make me feel bad. And so I'm choosing to be part of this community of practice, even though I know there are other communities of practice one of the points that the book makes is that we are members of multiple communities of practice at any given time. Right. Yeah. And with that, I think comes moral obligations to tend our epistemological house. Now, sometimes we just decide, listen, it's where I'm living. It's leopard shoes. I don't care about the zebra people. I don't care about people who say you shouldn't wear flats. But I'm still aware that there's another view, right? So I think that's why I think we have to look at agency in that way. If they really were deceived, if they really did not have access, and I think it's very powerful when the President of the United States says something, because we're supposed to be able to trust, at least to some degree, our political leaders. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think that one is a special kind of case, but it impacts agency. Right. Yeah. And also just to go back to the dismantling of the cognitive dissonance we would experience, right? Yes, there might be competing theories, but the fact that I need to sort out the framing of my thinking and my sense of belonging and my group identity and the identity of my community of practice, it's very easy to discard those. In fact, it's exactly what's happening. They're part of the conspiracy, right? The facts. Well, we know very well alternate facts, right? And then, of course, the halo effect or halo bias. And we can talk about President Trump as an example where it doesn't matter what he did, and he said it himself, he could kill someone, shoot someone, Fifth Avenue wouldn't lose a single voter or along those lines. But that's because he recognizes that the good that people perceive in him overrides anything else he might do because of this, I guess, bias that ultimately exists almost non-voluntarily. We have to admit that that's what bias is in many ways, right? As in, it's my heuristics, cognitive heuristics that make my life easier by not having to wrestle with all these various inputs that are coming in. Yeah, I guess I would push back a little bit because I think there's a small group of people for which I would say that applies. They might have what Aristotle called, unforeseeable ignorance, right? Which renders their actions involuntary. I think you're responsible for your epistemological choices. I choose that leopard high heels are the bomb, right? Are the greatest thing since sliced bread, which means that if I decide to commit murder, which I would never, as an ethics professor, do that. But if I decided to commit murder on the basis of that belief, I'm responsible for that. I don't get to say, oh, well, I have this belief that like anyone who doesn't wear leopard high heels is wrong. Well, I chose that belief.
But do people think like that? I mean, in your experience, have you found that people actually think like that? That people, sit there debating, discussing, or cognitively making choices to believe?
I don't think it's like they're not in a philosophical sense of I will now sit down and reflect. But my experience, I'm from Montana, which is a more conservative state, and know many people who are more conservative politically. And when you talk to them, and for some people, they made a choice a long time ago to be a conservative. Yeah. And so they see this as whoever the conservative standard bearer is, they're going to go with whoever that is, right? Because they made that choice.
Yeah. Which we see that in Australia as well a lot. I mean, it's
right. So there are other people who really, like when Trump came on the scene, like they found him entertaining, they thought he was cool, and he had this rep from like the 80s, and so there were lots of different reasons why people might be attracted to, whether it's Oath Keepers or the 3%ers. We have lots of those groups in Montana, lots of those militia groups in Montana. The Unabomber was hanging out in Montana for a while, right? So there's lots of reasons I think people adopt views, some of which are complicated, but to say that they don't have any choice, right? I think we might have different reasons for adopting a view, but I think for some people, they might say, listen, I wasn't crazy about Trump, but like, I don't like how liberals talk down to me, or I don't like feeling like people look down on me because I'm not comfortable with X, Y, and Z. Right. So I think, and disinformation is really serious. And you're right about the bias and heuristics, but part of what we teach at the War College is,
it's to unpack that.
It's to unpack what are your biases, what are your heuristics. And I think my experience has been that a lot of people it's not that they're uncritical, it's that they've made a decision, right? They're sort of aware of things, but they choose to, sort of like the Johnny Depp and, Amber Heard trial, like people picking sides, be like, yeah, I know Johnny Depp did all this stuff, but I really like Pirates of the Caribbean. And so I'm going to be in camp Depp, right? Yeah. So I think there's all kinds of complicated reasons. And I'm really nervous about just saying, well, because you were the victim of disinformation, that you don't have any agency or any responsibility for the actions you take based on that disinformation. Now, I think there are different levels of responsibility, right? You could have the person that really is clueless and consumed all this stuff and who was radicalized online. And we see those, right? And they get so pulled in that we would say, yeah, in some sense, they've lost their certainly epistemological agency. And if they're acting on the basis of being essentially brainwashed, right? So that changes the picture of responsibility. But if I decided to join the Oath Keepers because I want to usher in the next Civil War, and I'm consuming all of this stuff, and I made that intentional choice, like, I think we should hold that person responsible, right?
Yeah, that's. I don't mean to be confrontational. That's not my intention. Because I'm really trying to understand.
I think it's a great question. How much how responsible can we hold people who have consumed or been exposed or influenced by disinformation? And I think there's a range of influence and a range of agency. Just like, did you take the first drink and then things just got out of hand? Or did someone slip you a Mickey in your drink and you had no idea that you were intoxicated, right? I think those are very different cases, and there's all kinds of cases in between. So I think the disinformation thing isn't something I talk about in the book, but I think it's something that I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it really does. It impacts that agency question, how we think of to what degree is the obedience voluntary. There's certainly a lot of literature on this in war crimes literature, in Holocaust literature about to what extent, Chris Browning, who wrote the book Ordinary Men, was my colleague at PLU when I first got there. It's a great book if you haven't read it.
No,
I think it raises this issue about the influence of ideology and what it can do to just ordinary people. Who just said, I absolutely buy this, and I'm going to do heinous things.
And it's because and obviously I have a personal connection as an ethnic Bosnian who's arguably ethnic group, not myself personally, was targeted for genocide. I'm trying to wrestle, and I've been spoken to people who were directly impacted by it to try and understand how is it that good people come to do evil things. Because I mean, and I talk about war crimes a lot because nobody's born a war criminal. There are elements that will, and in fact, when I spoke with David Wedham about this, he brought up the fact that, I forget his name, a sergeant in the Royal Marines, name escapes me now, but his circumstances, and he was the one that executed an Afghan prisoner, Taliban prisoner. It was used as his defense, not merely mitigating circumstances. The fact that he didn't, he was fatigued, he didn't receive all the right training. His father had recently passed away, either just before he deployed or while he was on deployment. So his cognitive state was deeply affected by his environment, and he was used to turn over from, I think, murder to I don't know. In other words, his crime was diminished, and it was used as a defense, not merely as mitigating circumstances, which is a powerful recognition. I think a relatively new one that we can even talk about these things, and I think that's the point you're making. That this is all post realpolitik, post might is right, post the CNN factor, where we actually get to see things, and as civilians get to reconcile with what we see on our TVs of our own soldiers doing in our own name. And it's very difficult to recognize that my social group can do evil things. And again, for all the various biases that we know of, in-group versus out-group, and, everything my people do is good and just and righteous, and the rest, the others, aren't. So I think an obedience, by its definition, as you described it, i.e. intentional, voluntary, and legitimate authority, is so deeply infused in how I conceptualize the world around me, which is the reason I brought in Trump and the kind of oath keepers, because ultimately we can say it was intentional, voluntary, and by the absolutely most legitimate authority, in the country. But here I want to maybe ask you about Ehren Watada, who chose not to go to Iraq in 2003. He was a second lieutenant, I think, at the time.
Yep.
And of course was then court-martialed, et cetera, et cetera. And it's only post the realization and kind of the general global opinion shifting that this was not really a just war, and that Iraq might have been a mistake. And of course, Chilcot review in the UK, which basically explicitly says it was not, that it was groupthink, and we need to stop and think about it next time. What was it about him that nudged him into, I guess, disobedience, given that everybody else was, hey, we're going?
Yeah, so it's a super interesting case, because where I taught during that time was literally next door to a Joint Base Fort Lewis McChord, which is where he was stationed, right? Wow. And I was teaching ROTC cadets. So this was the subject of some, shall we say, energetic conversations for a couple of years in my class. And I think at the time, while there were people like myself who were on record opposed to the Second Iraq War, I think we were a minority, right? And I opposed it on just war grounds, right?
And I think he did as well, right? In his defense,
he did as well. He said, "Listen, I'll go back to Afghanistan. Like he can deploy me to Afghanistan because I think that's a just war, but I won't go to Iraq." So my sense, I never talked to him, but my sense from the reports and conversations and people who knew him was that this was a principled stand, right? And I think the fact that he was willing to go back to Afghanistan demonstrates that. So this wasn't I just don't want to deploy. He's like, listen, send me to Afghanistan. But I'm not going to Iraq. But that raises an interesting question about what information was he basing that judgment on. And so chapter 7 in the book is about prudence, what Aristotle calls practical reasoning, this capacity to think about, and not in a platonic, a wisdom kind of way, but in a very practical deliberation kind of way. What are the relevant factors in the case, and what do I need to think about in order to get to a judgment? that this war is immoral and I shouldn't deploy. And so I think that piece, that capacity that we have to think about things, and for him to step outside, and it became clear later, there were other people who agreed with him, but who weren't willing to take the same stand for career reasons, for peer pressure reasons, for lots of not wanting to disappoint their mom reasons.
So were they disobedient?
So the interesting question is, if you know something's wrong, or if you think something's wrong, and you do it anyway, like, how are we to think about that?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I think we could say, I think from the perspective of the U.S. military at the time, he made a voluntary, intentional choice.
Yeah.
And he was in the book, I talk about a range of between obedience and disobedience. He was out there. He was explicitly disobedient. He made public pronouncements to say, I will not go. He's not like my 14-year-old who's like, I tell him to clean his room and he's slow rolling it and passive aggressive. I didn't hear what you said, I didn't get the text right. That's somewhere in between. Watada was like, I'm not going. He was in the newspapers. Like, he was very I would say that was explicit disobedience. I think looking at that, I would say that was justified disobedience. Right? Because the thing about, if you're going to be disobedient, first of all, you have to be willing to take the consequences, which he did. But you also, I make the case, you have to be able to articulate the reasons for your disobedience to your community of practice. Yeah.
This is a slippery slope for me. This is where it gets tricky for me. Yeah.
In his case, there were two communities of practice. One was the military, right, the profession. And the other was the broader sort of civilian community for whom he works, right? Everyone in the military works for me. Well, not me personally. No. The citizenry
is employed by the state and the citizens.
Right. And if he'd gone to Iraq, he would have been doing what he was doing in my name, right? Yeah. So there's sort of two audiences. And if you're going to be disobedient, my argument is that you have to try to rationalize that or explain that or articulate that to the community of practice in question. And it may be the case, as in the case of, and I don't remember if I talk about this in the book, Colin Kaepernick and his NFL protest was an interesting case because, once again, multiple communities of practice to which he's appealing, multiple audiences. Some of those audiences he was persuasive to, others he was not, and then there were consequences. The NFL, notably, was one of the audience he was not able to persuade, right? But there has to be this attempt to make that articulation in terms of the shared values of that community of practice. Yeah. So Watada made his articulation in terms of the standards and the norms of the military profession, in particular, just war principles.
Yeah, based on the knowledge and research he himself did in preparation to deploy, which to me is basically he read and got exposed to information that made him question the dominant narrative of the community of practice that he's a part of. When I transfer that onto the Oath Keepers or whatever other group in the US or the vax hesitant community, I'm forced to apply the same lens on them. But I'm also, because of my own biases and my own understanding of the world, I'm then also, I have no choice but to shake my head and go, what are you thinking? But then I have to step back and go, okay, well, this is what they're reading. This is what they're seeing. This is the way they view the world. So the Oath Keepers are the Ehren Watadas of free America, right? In their view. And that's where my issue
is. So my question would be, could we say, because I hear what you're saying, could we say that the Oath Keepers attempted to articulate their position to the broader political community of practice? Right, to persuade people before they engaged in violence, right?
Well, I mean, if they got memberships, they must have, surely. I mean, if they're getting members, they must have. Yeah.
So that raises this interesting question. Like Millie talks about this notion of disciplined disobedience.
Yeah. Yeah, which I love.
And he says the tricky part with discipline disobedience is you have to be right.
Yes, exactly.
So we can really only judge if this was a good act of disobedience after the fact, right?
Exactly.
So we look back and say, yeah, Ehren Watada got it right. Right now we're looking at it saying, no, the Oath Keepers got it wrong.
Yeah.
But is it possible that in 20 or 30 years, we would have a different view? So I think you're right. I think this is why, people get nervous about books about obedience and disobedience.
Again, I just have to emphasize, I love it. I love the book. So please don't take my pushing back and asking.
I'm enjoying it immensely.
Yeah.
But I think there is a danger, right, to both obedience and to disobedience, right? Because we have lots of cases of Jim Jones, of other cult leaders who get people to do things, really heinous, awful things. Ordinary Men is another example where we get people to do things, or people disobey laws and hurt other people because God told me to do it, or my inner voice told me to do it. And so part of the book is to try to have some kind of check on whatever the epistemological universe is that you're in. You take the judgments that you acquired, and then you have to test that against your community practice. Now, it could be the community practice is wrong too, but at least we have some kind of check, and that's where the negotiation thing may come in, because professions change over time. Political communities of practice, religious communities of practice change over time. So I want to leave the space for that negotiation, but there is danger, right? And I don't want to, mitigate that. But at the same time, we want people to disobey when they're asked bad stuff.
Yes.
Right? Eddie Gallagher should not have done what he did.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
My dissertation,
just for my audience that is not necessarily familiar with the kind of SEALs piece of
he committed war crimes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. My dissertation was on the My Lai massacre from the Vietnam War, where Lieutenant Calley's troops killed upwards of 500 people and engaged in other heinous behavior. And his commander's response, that's, went in the trial, was, I didn't know what Calley was up to. Well, you should have, right? Because so that gets back to that. It's not just what you know, but what are you supposed to know?
Yeah.
Right.
That's why this is so important, because there's a mirror. Your book, and again, I'm a visual person. The way I see it in my mind, it forces the reader to put a mirror on their own behaviors and their own biases, the biases and the embodiment, the symbols, the subcultures, everything that when they put on, in this case, a uniform, everything that comes with that, as it applies to them in their lived experience as part of that unit, as part of that particular community of practice. And I think that's, as you said before, that's a really, really difficult thing to do, and to do so honestly, because of all the baggage that we carry, all the biases that we carry, all the kind of, evolutionary byproduct of, why we even have biases. It's a lot to wrestle with, but
it is.
Putting the mirror on is step one before you can start looking at, someone else and understanding someone else.
Yeah. One of the things I think about in the last 2 years, like there's things that have happened that I'm not sure when I go back and look at the book, like what I think about what I wrote. If I had to rewrite it now, how I would think about it, the compliance issue.
Well, just to ask you on that then, just while we're on Watada, but Stuart Schiller, the Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Schiller, who very publicly went on LinkedIn and basically had an outburst for a number of minutes about the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, accusing the higher-ups. And, of course, then there's an entire saga that goes from that, him being ultimately, I think, discharged or fired. And, again, he will argue that, and many of his supporters, if you just read the comments on LinkedIn, which is meant to be a professional platform rather than a Twitter-like platform or Facebook, right? But it gets really, really emotional and really deep and really serious very, very quickly. And two camps emerge. One that is completely in favor, that it's the right thing to do, to stand up and, you're a hero. Thank you, sir. All of these kind of notions of glorifying what he's done. And then there's the other side, right? the other side that's saying, well, no, if you had some issues and some challenges about the command, you should have done it appropriately from inside the system, et cetera, et cetera. You're a disgrace to the uniform, you've disgraced yourself, blah, 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 right? So it's going to be years from now that we determine whether he's a hero or villain, just like Watada. But ultimately, he's being absolutely disobedient, right?
Yeah, or at least on that end of the spectrum. I mean, I think we have lots of these examples. Not that I'm equating Schiller and Hugh Thompson from the My Lai massacre, but Hugh Thompson was not a popular dude at the time, right? It's only many years later that
just give us context as to what was
Hugh
Hugh's role.
Thompson was the helicopter pilot at the My Lai massacre.
Amazing,
who basically sets his helicopter down and tells his gunners to train their guns on Callie's troops, on the American troops that were massacring.
Incredible, yeah.
And sexually assaulting non-combatants in this village. And so if they don't stop, shoot them, right? Which arguably was perhaps disobedience, but for sure was disloyalty, right? And arguably saved quite a few lives. Right. And later he was commended for that. But he was not a popular dude at the time. And Callie, who was in command at My Lai at the time, was reified, and people said they're railroading him. And so I think you're raising this really interesting question, whether it's Schiller or the Oath Keepers or the anti-vaxxers, about these judgments we're making are in fact based on our own epistemological worlds, right?
Yeah.
And so what do we do when we disagree about epistemology, when we disagree about the basic facts of the matter or about the worldview or whatever it is that we use to make these judgments? And I think that's I try to address that in the book, but it's a complicated thing because I know that at least in the United States, maybe in Australia as well, a lot is made of the political polarization.
Yeah.
But I really think people need to go read the Federalist Papers and the hot sheets at the time of the American Revolution. Political polarization is not really a new thing, right? So, and people have always disagreed fundamentally about really, really, really deep stuff. And so that question of how we navigate obedience given differences in worldviews or given differences about what we think the right thing is, whether it's vaccines or going to war or getting out of a war or gun control or abortion or whatever it is, right? I think these are very difficult things to navigate, but I do think we have to step back, and I'm not willing to call sort of uncritical compliance or passive obedience or blind obedience. I'm not willing to call that a virtue.
No,
I don't think that's what moral people do. I think moral people do wrestle with these things and think about it, and they may make the wrong choice. They may lose the argument too. So this business of appealing to your community of practice, arguably Colin Kaepernick lost part of the argument, right? Maybe he's going to be persuasive in the long term, but he, in some sense we could say, at least at the time, he seemed to lose the argument. But I think that's part of it. But he attempted to make an appeal. It wasn't just, listen, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to tell you why, right? Part of being an ethical person as opposed to just a moral person is the ability to articulate your reasons. I couldn't agree more. And I also wholeheartedly agree that blind obedience is not virtue. But then I also have to come back and say, well, was I then blindly obedient when I deployed on my operations? Were all of those people that went to Iraq blindly obedient? I mean, are they not virtuous? Should they be part of some collective punishment because they, by that definition, they have some moral guilt in contributing to an unjust war, even if they might have fought it justly, et cetera, right? And then, it begs the bigger question, how do we then prevent that from happening the next time around? How do we equip and educate our soldiers and officers? Because we can't expect them all to be philosophers,
nor do we want them to, right? We can't
No,
afford
because we gotta get stuff done.
things
right?
done,
We got
right?
things to do.
So, and I do want to kind of as we lead out of this discussion, land on some ways on how we actually train for this kind of reasonable challenge. And I think that's kind of what you conclude the book with, or critical obedience. How do we train for that? How do we instill that quality in our soldiers and officers?
And first of all, while this is important for soldiers and officers, it's also important for civilians, because not just on the soldiers. So if the Iraq War was an unjust war, I bear the ultimate responsibility for that, right? That isn't just on the soldiers. So in terms of training, I think something like I love the Brits and the reasonable challenge idea and critical obedience. I think this is practice, which is why there are questions in the back of the book. That's why there are case studies. So I think what you do is you gather your people around and you talk about some reasonable scenarios that you might face or you think are going to happen. And you do what the Stoics say is we're going to pre-rehearse evils, right? So we're going to think about this situation before we get into it. And where are your lines? Like, getting into a situation is a bad time to think about where your red line is. You want to think about your red lines in advance. And so I think this is something, and it doesn't have to, like, I know everyone's training schedules are jacked. Like, this could be a 5-10 minute discussion max. Or you watch a movie where there are these issues. There's lots of great pop culture movies where these issues come up. My favorite awful one is Tears of the Sun with Bruce Willis, but it has these kinds of issues. So watch the movie, talk about it with your mates, and let's think about these things. So I think the more practice people have at thinking about these issues, maybe with really, really small issues, then it's that habituation, it's that practice, and then it gets easier. It's not ever easy, but when you go into combat, like, I'm assuming my students tell me I'm right about this. They don't just hand you like a firearm and say, good luck with that. No, like, you get trained and you have to take it apart and you have to practice with it and you have to do all this stuff and you got to drill. We do all kinds of drills in the military. You got to do moral drills too. It's the same thing.
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I did find it interesting you brought the Stoics in, who, if my reading of and memory serves appropriately, they were hard determinists, which I find.
Well, yeah, that's another book. That's my next book is the Stoics, but yes, that's a different kind of problem. But they did believe in rehearsing.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And thinking about bad things that could happen to you so that you could learn to calibrate. They're really worried about emotions, calibrate your emotions and your judgments.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's something that we can do in training environments and to have conversations. So there's some things you don't want people disobeying about. Right. But, and I talk about the difference between a garrison and combat context, but there are things where, like, the situation has changed or there's something going on, where we would have wanted someone to speak up, or we want someone to say, okay, why are we doing this again? And I think that's important. And it's important to be able to tell the difference between the two. Yeah. Right. Yeah. To know when to ask the question, to mount the reasonable challenge, and when it's not time for a committee discussion, as Princess Leia in Star Wars said.
Which is why I kind of the way I visualize it in my mind is this kind of idea of bumpers, because it's very difficult for me to expect somebody to know something that they have never encountered, right? When they don't know what they don't know. So how can I hold them accountable or judge them for that if it's outside of their reach, right?
And they had, I would say, did they have any capacity to
But I guess everybody has capacity, especially now with the internet. Arguably everybody has the capacity to go and read about just war.
Well, and it's not just that. It's moral imagination. I've never been in combat, right? But I think a lot about it and talk to people who have and read poetry and watch movies and try to figure out, and I talk about this in the book, right, that moral imagination is something that can help us bridge the gap. Now, you have to have a disposition, I think, or be willing to have the disposition to do that. So there's sort of what you don't know, But then are you aware that there's stuff that you don't know? I'm aware that I have a limited amount of knowledge about combat. And so I try to fill in my gaps. Now, if I just thought, hey, listen, I read this one book once, I've got it.
That's the problem, isn't it? Yeah.
Full metal jacket. I've got it covered. Guys, let me tell you what combat is like.
Yeah.
Right? Like people like you be looking at me going, girlfriend? I don't think so. Like
well,
that would be weird.
I say this publicly in the pod a number of times. I mean, I've never fired a gun in anger. So I've never been a combat officer or soldier, but I can certainly empathize. I've been on the receiving end of various forms of munitions as a civilian, but it does, all of that plays into the same, I guess, discussion of what they could have done and should have known. And it's a tricky one, which I think is why these types of conversations hopefully can reach a number of people to at least invite them to go and look for things. And the reason I say this is because just because someone can, I've got a lot of friends, a lot of my peers in the Special Forces community. And I know for a fact that they would love to be able to sit down and read and discuss these things. But it's just not part of their everyday experience to have the capacity to do so, purely because their jobs are of such that there's no time, unfortunately, and there's never enough of them. And, everybody wants something from them, and they absolutely have to embody an idea as a self-protective mechanism for the jobs that they have to do. They would love to be able to sit down and read and talk and have these kind of discussions and this type of discourse. But unfortunately, their lived experience and their community of practice doesn't, unfortunately, embody that as the norm, as one of the kind of behaviors that they have capacity to do, which is a challenge.
Except I find it hard to believe that any special forces units fail to do after action reviews or what we call hot wash in the Navy. That's a place to have these conversations, right? Even if it's only 30 seconds, even if it's a minute or two. So I understand the time issue, but then and this is maybe a good place to pull the strands together. My question is, what moral obligations do we have around our own epistemological commitments in universe? What do I have an obligation to know? What is my obligation to be aware of my own biases, my own heuristics? If I'm going to live in the leopard shoe bubble, like what are my moral obligations around that? Certainly I can choose that. But there are moral obligations that go with that. If I choose to be a member of a religious community of practice, there are moral obligations that come not just to my other community members, but to people outside of that community that maybe my community of practice has harmed, right? So I think we're sort of pushed back to that, disinformation, epistemology question, which is not as prominent in the book as it would be if I were writing the book now, given the last, say, 5 years in American politics and international events. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And on that note, I think, Pauline, I do, again, just want to emphasize once more how much I've enjoyed it. And in many ways, I'm envious of your students, because if this is the density of your discussions, then I'm slightly envious for them having the time to enjoy these discussions, because I really do believe that this is absolutely one critical part of it, is to make the time, whether it is in a hot wash and AAR type arrangement, to discuss not just the tactics, but to discuss the ethics of particular circumstances, missions, operations, both for the military, but then and I do want to stress again, I wholeheartely agree with the civilian aspect, which is something that I did want to touch on, but I think we've kind of broadly covered it. And I'm also conscious that we jumped around a little bit, so I'll just throw over to you if there's any kind of final comments you want to make, in case you didn't, make some points that you wanted to make.
No, just first of all, thank you for the conversation and reading the book and reading it so closely, and such great questions and the kinds of things that you're raising and very gently pushing back on are really, really important questions. So I really value the conversation. And I hope people, especially people who don't have time to read, will listen to the podcast and at least start thinking about some of these issues. Because at the end of the day, I wrote the book because my students asked me hard questions about obedience. So this is, in some way, this book is inspired by them and a gift back to them. But also as a parent, with two boys. And in the dedications, I dedicate the book to Mac and Trevin because, when you're a parent, you learn lots about obedience and disobedience.
I've got a 2-year-old, so
yeah. So you know that. So
resonated.
These are sort of life questions that we're navigating. So I hope people will listen to the podcast and at least just be aware that maybe there's some questions they should be asking themselves. And certainly these are the kinds of questions my students at the War College, we wrestle with this stuff all the time. And they ask really good questions and they're really hard. And I think in the United States right now, we're seeing these hearings around January 6th. And I think we're wrestling with trying to sort all of this out and what it means. So these are not easy questions. So hopefully people find the conversation useful.
Absolutely. And on that note, Pauline, it's been absolutely fascinating. I knew it would be, but it certainly surpassed my expectations. So thank you so much once again for the time you've given me today.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please take a moment to like and review the show wherever you get your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes. Thank you, and until the next time.